Introduce our next speaker, Sally Haslanger. So Sally is the Ford Professor of Philosophy and Women's and Gender Studies at MIT. Sally works in metaphysics and epistemology, social and political philosophy, feminist theory, and critical race theory. And the building blocks of Sally's research program consist of social practices, social structure, structural explanation, ideology, and cultural critique, and many more. And these are developed in a great number of papers and her widely acclaimed book, Resisting Reality. And I think to keep things on time, Sally, it's my great honor to have you with us today. And the title of your talk is How to Distinguish Systemic, Structural, and Institutional Racism.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, great to be part of these conversations. And I'm very confused about many things, and it's always helpful to try out ideas and sort of engage with others. Okay, so here's the outline. As you can see, this is the building of the Statue of Liberty in New York. I'm going to start with introductions and questions, then talk about how I understand systems and structures. I'm then going to try to elaborate my conception of structure using my notion of practice. Then we'll look a little bit at resistance, not very much, I'm afraid, because we only have a half an hour, and I'll draw a conclusion. As you'll see, I did in the title, I'm not going to talk that much about institutions today, but and there's a lot of literature on that social ontology of institutions. But I'll say a few things in passing. My main goal will be to talk about systems and structures. So racism is a core example that motivates me, though most of my discussion is going to be about the broader questions. I think that it would be good to motivate what I'm doing by thinking about racism. And so I'm going to provide two quotes. So in 1963, after the bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church that killed 4 girls, Martin Luther King, sorry, that should have had Martin Luther King. I thought I corrected this, I'm sorry, gave a eulogy for them. And one passage reads, "They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity. And so this afternoon, in a real sense, they have something to say to each of us in their death. They say to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered them, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy that produced the murderers." And I think this is such a deep moment. I mean, imagine there you are giving the eulogy and saying, don't just focus on the individual, we need to talk about the system. Here's another quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. He says, "But all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, I would add the philosophy, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body." So I think that this prompts 3 questions. How should we understand systemic, structural, and institutional racism? What does it mean to say that injustice is systemic or structural? And are these different terms for the same thing? And I'm motivated by this because I gave a talk not long ago where someone said, well, aren't systematic, structural, and institutional racism all just the same thing? And I felt, well, no, they're not. And it's important to see the differences. And it's motivated by Martin Luther King's quote. And by Ta-Nehisi Coates, how do systematic and structural racism land upon the body? And how might we address it? How might philosophy help? So I'm going to do a little social ontology now. So what are systems and structures? So start with a quote very generally from Stuart Shapiro, who does philosophy of mathematics, and I draw on in one of my papers about structural explanation. I define a system to be a collection of objects with certain relations. An extended family is a system of people with blood and marital relationships. A chess configuration is a system of pieces under spatial and possible move relationships. A structure is the abstract form of a system, highlighting the interrelationships among the objects and ignoring any features of them that do not affect how they relate to other objects in the system. So my family, for example, is a small local system that includes particular individuals: Steve, Isaac, Zena, Sparky, and these days Daisy, because Daisy's my grand dog and Isaac is away, so I'm taking care of her. You saw her a minute ago, who stand in relations such as parent of, child of, spouse of, sibling of, dog of, etc. And this particular Haslanger system instantiates a more general structure of nodes, or what are sometimes in graph theory called vertices, and relations, which are sometimes called edges, that are also found in other family. So here's the system. I think the system is a complex dynamic system. I'll say a little bit more about that. It is instantiated with individuals. It is material. And then there's a structure that we can see that highlights the nodes and edges, or the nodes and relations that hold between the things and are going to help us explain the movement of the things in the material system. So a system is a token dynamic instance of a structure. The nodes are instantiated, and the structure I think of as the skeleton of the system. Social systems are material. They're not simply composed of actions. So in the social ontology world, there's a lot of emphasis on joint intentionality is what creates sociality and such like that. And, you know, I'm very much at a distance from that conception of social ontology and the social. A transportation system includes vehicles, roads, tracks, signs. A healthcare system includes hospitals and ambulances and insurance forms. So I think of these as what I'll come to call the apparatus of the cultural technique, these material things typically. So here again, this is a system that is highly material. It lands on the body. The nodes may be material. So I stand in a relation of ownership to my bike. Ownership is a social relation. I stand in that relationship to a bike, my house. I stand plausibly in co-stewardship to my neighborhood, the park, the sidewalks, the neighbors, and maybe the earth. So the nodes are material, but I think that there's a way in which we might want to say also the relations may be material. My house and my neighbor's house are about 7 feet apart. Both are 10 feet from the sidewalk. And the condition and structural integrity of the houses, that is the relations between their parts, have a non-trivial effect in structuring local human relations. So I think being on, like being securely attached to, is a material relation. And that is part of the social system that constitutes my neighborhood. And in fact, we've had to deal with a neighbor next door because the tiles were falling off his house and endangering the people on the street. And that affected my relationship with the homeowner. So social systems are embedded in broader physical systems, their environment, that also affect their functioning. The broader systems may impose constraints, so the physical laws do, or provide inputs, weather and climate. So there's this difference between a closed system and an open system. And in an open system, the environment has inputs and the system itself has outputs. And the environment of a system may include other systems. Because systems do not entirely saturate a social space, systems can overlap and intersect. And I think this is very important for the phenomenon of intersectionality. But I think I was referring to it earlier when I talked about the school, a public school in the US being part of an educational system, part of a healthcare system, part of the carceral state. And those are systems that overlap and have a shared physical entity, the school, and a shared legal entity, because the school is also a legal and civic entity, that are parts of both of them. So this is something I think is useful in thinking about intersectionality. So we were just talking about the materiality of systems. Systems, remember, are the token instantiations of structures, dynamic. They're dynamic token material instantiations, but are structures also material? Well, some people, when they talk about the structure of a system as an abstraction, so even Shapiro talks about that, there's a tendency to think, oh, it's in the head. right? What we've done is abstracted. We've done this mental cognitive thing on the system and abstracted and have this idea of the structure. So we should ask, is it ideational rather than physical, virtual rather than material? And do structures have causal powers? Well, I think there are two moves in identifying the structure of a system. The first move gets us relations, right? The tile is on, you know, the roof, right? That's how it's positioned. And relations are not mere mental abstractions. The second move gets us generality. X rests on Y, and X can be occupied by different token things. So these are both moves as we're moving from the concrete system or the concrete instantiation to the structure. In order for a house to stand, the roof rests on load-bearing walls. It transfers the weight of the roof to the foundation. And the relation rests on, as an X rests on Y, is causally responsible for the house remaining upright. So yes, structures have causal powers. It's a physical relation with physical effects. It is not an idea or a representation, or merely a representation. We can represent it, but it's not merely a representation. The second move about generality, sometimes we're interested in the token relations with a specific X and Y, but typically for the purposes of explanation, we're interested in the types. So when we move from talking about systems to talking about structures, we're often trying to generalize and give an explanation of why the systems of this kind work in this way. It's because of their structure. And of course, there's broad consensus that there are objective types. They aren't in the head. So complex systems, there are three different, basically oversimplifying, there are three different kinds of systems. There's simple systems, chaotic systems, and complex systems. So chaotic systems where they're just disorganized, right? It's very difficult to explain what's going on in a chaotic system. Simple systems are mechanistic, and you can usually do what explanation you need by a kind of reduction to the parts and the mechanistic relationships between the parts. But complex systems are different. They have an organized complexity, and it's generally thought to be not explicable through reduction. So they're self-organizing, self-reproducing, and adaptive, and they're non-linear or stochastic. So here's, the kind of examples you often get is ecosystems, economies, climate, brains, anthills, societies, and such like that. And I picked the anthill because of the ant trap, Brian Epstein's. I thought, okay, ants, we can talk about ants. So the behavior of the individuals in the system are stochastic, but their interactions give rise to stable emergent features of the whole by virtue of the internal structure. So you can't just talk about how the individuals are interacting. You have to talk about the structure and the ties, the relations between different entities, and that affects how the individuals evolve, and that affects how the system evolves. And so it's not purely explicable reductionistically. The structure affects the individuals and the interaction in the system and the interactions that are possible. And in such systems, local interactions can spontaneously self-organize without external intervention or central authorities. And it's generally recognized that societies are complex systems. They're organized complexity. Okay, practices and social relations. So structures are networks of relations that form the skeleton of the system. There's the picture again. How should we understand those relations? How do they emerge and how do they change? They're not designed by people. Well, sometimes they are by law, but they evolve socially, and they're embedded in each other, in relation to each other in different ways in different cultures, of course. So in my view, at least a central set of those relations are established through social practices. So any human behavior is conditioned by multiple factors. So consider a meal. The factors that condition what we choose to eat are the physical demands on the human body, the geographical context and the edible things in it, the social, political, legal context, that make certain edibles salient or available or safe, trade pacts and all of those sorts of things, Food and Drug Administration, the economic constraints on what we can afford, and the social meaning of the different foodstuffs, that is, for example, culture. So when Trump invited some championship sports team, I don't even remember which one, to come to the White House and have a Burger King, people thought it was ridiculous, right? Well, why? Well, Burger King has a particular social meaning in the US, and it's not the sort of thing that you give to people when you're trying to celebrate their wonderful accomplishments. So, and we do this all the time. The social meaning, what we offer at a wedding reception or a funeral is different from what we offer at a picnic, typically. So the social meaning is a factor in conditioning human behavior. So semiotic communities share a cultural techne. And so these public meanings, and they have to be public because they're going to organize our interaction, are internalized as we learn the languages of our local cultures. This is the basis for our fluency and social skills and capacities for code switching. So I share some cultural tools with my philosophical colleagues across the globe that I don't share with my neighbors, but I share other tools with my neighbors and still other with my dog. There's Sparky. You can get a picture of him. I mean, dogs are part of our social community. They have social learning. We interact with them and train them, et cetera, et cetera. Tools that are designed for one purpose, so cultural tools and meanings that are designed for one purpose are used for other purposes, including critique. And this is relevant to David's point too. So I actually think that these cultural tools are very transposable in important ways, transposable. So here's a quote from William Sewell. Users of a culture will form a semiotic community in the sense that they will recognize the same set of oppositions, or how I think of it as the same set of meanings, and therefore be capable of engaging in mutually meaningful symbolic action. To use the ubiquitous linguistic analogy, they'll be capable of using the grammar of the semiotic system to make understandable utterances. So the fact that there is this grammar doesn't restrict us and tell us what you have to say, just as the grammar of language or the lexicon doesn't determine what we have to say. So I think the structure agency question can be easily addressed. If those of you who are worried about that, we can talk more. So we have this what I call the cultural techne, the set of social meanings. And we do in part because coordination around resources, and I take these to be things of positive and negative value, is a fundamental human task. And our ability to develop flexible forms of coordination that can be passed down through social learning is the key to our evolutionary success. So I define, and I'm going to give it to you verbally, but then I'm going to draw a picture. Hopefully that makes it a little more accessible. So I think that because we need to coordinate, we develop social practices, which are patterns of learned behavior that, at least in the primary instances, enable us to coordinate as members of a group in creating, distributing, managing, maintaining, and eliminating a resource or multiple resources. So keep in mind the resource, although that's a positive term usually, can also be negative. We have to find place to put toxic waste. We have to coordinate about recycling, for example. And this is due to mutual responsiveness to each other's behavior and the resources in question, as interpreted through the shared meanings or cultural schemas, what I call a cultural techne. So here we are, we're trying to coordinate. And what happens is that we develop a cultural techne, which is a set of social meanings that enables us to interact with the thing that's considered valuable or negatively valuable, whatever. So for example, we might consider a bunny a pet, and if we do, we're going to behave in certain ways toward it. So we internalize these social meanings, and we do so. So what happens is that the presentation of the bunny, for example, is going to make, due to this cultural techne, make certain aspects of the bunny salient, and it's going to make certain responses to it seem natural, etc. And that will affect what attitudes we have, which affects our interaction with the bunny, and then reinforces the social meanings. So if we think of the bunny as a pet, we're going to not kill it and eat it. we're not going to kill it and skin it. We're going to, keep it at home and feed it yummy lettuce and carrots, and we're going to maybe breed them to be fat and slow so that they don't run away and things like that. So as we interact with it, it reinforces that, oh, well, this bunny is a pet. It also happens with humans. So with the social meanings of a female body can be friend, mother, or sex object. The social meanings of a Black man can be friend, janitor, or criminal, depending on the context. And our cultural techne, or a cultural techne, is not inevitably ideological. Ours is because it is the background undergirding coordination that is sexist, racist, ableist, classist, etc. So I agree with David in using the pejorative use of the term ideology, but recognize that others use it in different ways. I'm just part of a tradition that goes back to Marx, which chooses to use the term with a negative valence. Okay. So some coordination problems, say correlative problems, require us all to act in the same way. What side of the street do we drive on? Other coordination problems, complementary problems, require us to act differently, but in sync. For example, ballroom dancing, a division of labor, and resource distribution. Complementary problems are solved by establishing roles that are suitably related. But we need more than roles. There is a function, this is Kaylin O'Connor, whose book is pictured. There's a function that social categories can play in these cases where we need complementary problems. In particular, actors use social categories to identify what sort of role each actor should play in social interaction. So categories solve, for example, the challenge of coordinating ballroom dance. Step forward if you're a woman and back if you're a man, step forward if you're a man and back if you're a woman. So these are rules that we use. And when you're fluent, when you're skilled in ballroom dancing, you don't need to sort of go through the process of reasoning or thinking. What you do is develop a skill and a fluency so that you just see your partner and you know exactly what to do. So societies can find themselves faced with a problem. What side do we drive on? And they can create problems. How should we greet each other? So greeting one, everyone kiss on the right and then the left cheek. Background assumptions allow for a correlative solution. We all do the same thing. But greeting two, women offers her hand and a man kisses it. Complementary background assumptions. So rather than a correlative, we have to divide, we have to signal different roles, and we have a division of labor, so to speak. Who knows? Because women should be modest and men should defer to their modesty. Who knows? Others, higher ranked person bows slightly, lower ranked person bows deeply. So coordination isn't just a sort of brute, we're in the wilderness and we have to figure out how to coordinate, but it's already embedded in a system of social meanings. So practices arise as a solution to coordination problems. They rely on social meanings, including category signals, norms, background assumptions, material infrastructure to solve the problems. They establish stable social relations and produce individuals who are highly motivated to conform. Those who are fluent in the social interactions needn't think twice about what to do. Performing one's role comes naturally, but it's second nature. For the Carole King, Judith Butler has a discussion of the Carole King about how, we aren't natural women. Anyway, it's useful to be able to rely on the same categories across tasks. So networks of social relations form that regularly position individuals in one category together, fulfilling roles that build up broad competencies and shape identity. So this is something that Charlotte Witt talks about. We want to develop competencies that are not just in nursing, for example, but women, but caregiving and elder care and all of these sorts of things. And so this ability to rely on the same competencies across tasks suggests that it's helpful to have broad categories rather than just, watchmaker. So gender rather than just watchmaker. Okay, whoa, that disappeared. So in the context of ideology that I'm coming from, the tradition that I'm coming from, the crucial role for understanding ideology is to distinguish it from repression. So those in the grip of an ideology do not need to be coerced to dominate or submit. They can form all by themselves. So they have become fluent in the practices, and they are prompted by very basic signals about how to think, how to feel, how to respond. So law, policy, culture, and community constrain possibilities by providing a stage setting, or what I think of as the structure for action. So we've got the structures. We were trying to figure out what those social relations are that provide the structure of the system. And now I'm going to talk about how those relations encode or power or carry power. So think of the mother and child. This relation between the mother and child is not just a biological relation, it's a legal relation, it's many other things, it's a social relation, and it is affected by legislators, judges, and law enforcement. So I couldn't be the mother of my children without a law that makes me the mother of my children. It's certainly affected by doctors and insurance companies, policymakers, bureaucrats, social workers, and school teachers. This is something I'm very deeply aware of as an adoptive mother, that my relation to my child is mediated through a set of rules and structures that tell me what powers I have and what powers I don't have. But it's also affected by neighbors and community, churches, families of origin and other caregivers, fathers and spouses. And I'm thinking of the ones in green as mainly institutional, but our power relations are not just through institutions. Think of, again, employer-employee. That is also more institutional, but it's not simply institutional. And what's being affected, so the individuals who occupy the nodes are affected by the structure of relations and practices that we're expected to participate in. So individuals can have good intentions and resist the problematic forces working on them at their relationships, but this doesn't change the structure, because I only have as much power as a mother as the law provides me, and as the doctors and insurance company and the schools and the teachers and the policymakers and bureaucrats and social workers. I can have my children taken away from me. And that's been threatened more than once because, there are laws and social workers and doctors who say I'm an incompetent mother, etc. So, resistance. What can we do about structural and systemic injustice? We need to understand the basins of attraction and tipping points in the systems we're concerned about. Systems can accommodate perturbations. This is what I was talking about, the wobbling, and maintain themselves, but small changes can cascade and make a significant difference. And this is exactly what Cass Sunstein was talking about yesterday. So you've got these different equilibrium points, and a stable equilibrium point, you've got the wobble, but you come back to equilibrium. If you have an unstable equilibrium point in a complex system, then a little change can make a huge difference because of the cascading effects. There are two different kinds of unstable points. We usually can't predict cascades, so we have to maintain hope in counterpublics and prefigurative politics to keep wobbling the systems so that maybe we can get to the point of unstable equilibrium. We face many collective action problems, and most change is going to make things worse before they get better. But I think social movements are our best bet. Elite and state action can help, but is unreliable and is usually only effective when coupled with social movement work. So here we are. I've already suggested that one's own private action is not sufficient to change the structure of relationships that manage power. It may change your family, but it doesn't change the system until you get enough of them, and then it starts to wobble and maybe we get it to be unstable. Individual resistance may provide an example for others to follow, but the impact is usually small and there are big risks and costs for individuals. Another strategy is to convince elites or become an elite with power to change the organization, the laws, etc. This is a favorite strategy of academics. But organizations and laws rarely change by top-down activism unless there's bottom-up readiness and pressure. And not all power is formal or institutional. Elites, even elite artists who are our culture, are powerful in the culture world, have limited power to change common sense. So to motivate critical reflection and invite transformation, an important step is to change the material and semiotic conditions so that reliance on the problematic cultural techne does not achieve the intended coordination. So here's the picture again. We need to change the material and the semiotic conditions, but changing the material and semiotic conditions, again, it can happen by law and policy and through institutions. It can also happen in small systems like my family, but what we really need is very broad changes in both the material and semiotic conditions. Reason and argument doesn't always work, but as Anderson points out, between pure argument and violence is a wide range of contentious activities that are more or less disruptive of habitual ways of life, from petitioning, publicity campaigns, theatrical performances, candlelight vigils, litigation, and political campaigns to street demonstrations, boycotts, teach-ins, sit-ins, picketing strikes, and building occupations. Okay, so tying the threads together, a cultural techne is not just a collection of attitudes or even a collection of cognitive mechanisms. It is the cultural dimension of the local social regulation system. When internalized by individuals, it provides tools for psychosomatic self-regulation, because that self-regulation is going to be important because we are, the participants in the culture and make it happen. And that enables fluent coordination with others and structures our subjectivity. Because it coordinates us, it has some normative force. Coordination is good. This is something Lon was talking about. Yet insofar as it regulates our interactions in ways that are problematic, it is an apt target for critique. But ideology critique is, of course, a daunting task. I mean, it can happen in a philosophy classroom, but we need it as more than that. So how should we understand systemic, structural, and institutional racism? What does it mean to say that injustice is systemic or structural? Are they different terms for the same thing? How does systematic and structural racism land upon the body, and how might we address it? So structural injustice occurs when the practices that create the network of positions and relations distribute resources unjustly, distort our understanding of what's valuable, or organize us in ways that are unjust or harmful or wrong. Systemic injustice occurs when an unjust structure is maintained in a complex system that is self-reinforcing and adaptive, and creates subjects whose identity is shaped to conform to it. How do they land on the body? Subjects are interpolated. I gestured at that with my example of repression, interpolation, and the hybrid cases. Subjects are interpolated to enact injustice and to bear it without complaint, and those who resist it face coercion. So I want to emphasize the materiality of the systems and the structures, and the materiality or the embodiment of these systems and the ideology, the cultural semiotics in us and our minds and our bodies. It's not just our minds, our bodies are conditioned to behave in certain ways, whether we want them to or not. And how might we address such racism? I think we should provide resources to support broad social movements that change not only formal institution, but also the practices that include the culture and the material conditions. Thank you.
That was a terrific talk. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And I have a site bibliography here. If you have the handout, you can find a very tiny bibliography also on the handout.
Wonderful, wonderful. This is so much needed to clarify these distinctions. So the floor is open for questions, and I see Jenny. And then...
that was really wonderful.
Thanks.
I found myself wondering about something. I mean, so much of this proceeds by structures and organizations and people just proceeding as normal in an unthinking kind of way, automatically these things happening. And it occurred to me that there was at one time a lot of hope that some good could come out of the pandemic because it disrupted all of our normal practices and the ways that things function together and the habits. And I was wondering about how you feel about that line of thought.
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. And I think there's a lot of empirical work that I should know about in order to really give an adequate answer. But one thing is, I do think that when people are at risk and vulnerable, they have a tendency to revert back to what's familiar, what's easy, what's manageable. And so when talking about, say, childcare, we know that women have been hugely burdened by childcare under the pandemic. And that's in part due to the past, that men haven't been as involved as maybe they should have been along the way. And it was a huge learning curve for them to do it. But also, I think that people are anxious and they're not going to learn new skills as easily under conditions where they're very anxious and feeling overwhelmed and things are unfamiliar. So I think that there's some of that.
Yeah.
But I also think that there are changes in the sense of talking about essential workers, and the fact that they started to be called essential workers. That's a semiotic shift. It's a really key semiotic shift. And if we can begin to understand that semiotic shift and take advantage of it, I think that that could be really important. I also think that people learned that teaching your children all day, every day is really exhausting. And so there's a different understanding of what teachers do and how teachers work and what the demands on teachers are and how essential they are. So I think that there's a combination of potentiality for the disruption having some positive consequences, but I think it has already also had some really negative consequences, right? The essential workers being infected at a much higher rate, people losing their homes, people, women being completely overwhelmed with childcare. So it's kind of a mix.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point about the disruption, which even as it's having positive effects may cause people to pull back. It's a kind of backlash effect in a way to return to the most,
So disruption is, so I'm a believer in disruption, but disruption is very dangerous because when you disrupt things, you can freak people out and they start getting really, revert to the tradition. This is what's happening, I think, a lot with the MAGA phenomenon. There's a lot of change. And so we go MAGA, not we, but, people go MAGA because they're so freaked out at the disruption that's being caused by, Black Lives Matter or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think another example on the positive side that we're seeing right here actually is restaurants are finally starting to open up a bit in Canada. People are apparently having a lot of trouble recruiting low-wage restaurant workers because people don't want to return to that kind of work. So I think it could have an interesting effect on the workforce. But anyway.
And the quitters phenomenon. There's in the US, people talk about the quitters. There are a lot of people who don't want to go back to work 60 hours a week, right? It's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm sorry. And so the quitters, what's going to be the new normal?
Thanks.
Great. So we have Ron next.
Thank you very much. I saw a lot in the talk that I agree with. And I wanted to talk to you. I've been writing about adaptive preferences, which is a phenomenon, broadly speaking, of people who conform with oppressive practices. And I wanted to just question you a little bit more about your thinking about these kinds of cases. On the one hand, you said that ideology leads people to conform all by themselves, which I think is very much a traditional adaptive preferences line. The end, you said they conform because they'd be coerced if they didn't conform. But in a way, once you have coercion, you don't need adaptive preferences anymore.
True.
And so I just wondered about how you thought about this. It seemed to me like once, granted that a lot of this behavior is going to be overdetermined, as it were, the man has many ways of bringing about about the oppressive world, many tools at his disposal. I just wondered how you thought about the connection between coercion and adaptive preferences. So one thing when I think about coercion, there's this old kind of feminist, what I think of really a feminist line from someone like Susan Brandmiller, that what really keeps the patriarchy in place is the ubiquitous threat of violence against women. And that's why women can't have jobs, as it were, or walk by themselves at night, why they need a man to protect them, and all this kind of stuff is this sort of ubiquitous threat. And that seems like a kind of coercion. And once you have that in place, I just wonder whether ideology is actually a causal, it's some kind of explanation of what's going on, but I wonder whether it's really playing a causal role and whether people aren't just responding to coercion.
Great, that's a good question. And I went through that slide really fast because I was short of time. But I come out of that tradition of Althusser and Foucault, where the idea is that modernity, and I don't like that word, I actually hate it. What modernity has done is moved us to think that explicit and outright coercion is morally wrong and unacceptable. And so the way the state and the culture and whatever do something similar more insidiously is to get people to discipline themselves to perform the tasks that they're supposed to and identify with the task so that coercion is not needed. Mm-hmm. And so I think that what happens, the way I think of it is sometimes, we're in a maze and the structure, is of walls. And what you do is when you hit the wall, it hurts. And so what you do is you learn how to run the maze without hitting the wall, right? And you learn how to run it. And sometimes you may never, you may never even feel a threat of coercion because you're so skilled in running it without hitting the wall. And it's very much part of your sense of your identity and your success as a person of the kind you are, that you don't hit the walls, right? You just keep your pace and you never get stopped and you're whatever, but the walls are still there. And this is the kind of Kate Mann point, that there is, for those who are not sufficiently fluent, there's a wall there. We don't always run up against it, but it's there. But it's not actively coercing us day to day, because what we've done is disciplined ourselves. And so this is something I think in my own personal experience, given my own history of eating disorders, the idea that you look at your body and the lens through which you see your body is distorted because any evidence of flab or fat or whatever just sort of presents itself to you, and you have to do something to get rid of it. No one is coercing you to be that. No one in my life has ever told me that I should lose weight, right? But that doesn't stop me from disciplining myself. I mean, now, thankfully, I don't have any, I've gotten over my deceiving. I have a very good relationship with food, etc., and with exercise. But it worked in and through me for a very long time. And I think that that's the sort of thing that counts as adaptive. See, it's not even quite adaptive preferences. I mean, I don't think that my relationship to my body, my surveillance relationship to my body, is about preferences. I mean, maybe it is if you have a certain notion of preference, but it's about a kind of responsiveness that is a kind of, I don't know how to even think about it. It's a way of being embodied in this body that I didn't choose, and that I don't like, and I wanted all the time to get rid of, but it still conditioned my everyday life and my relationship with every bite of food I took. Is that making sense?
Yeah, so I think of Cape Mann as kind of as the modern updating of this Brown-Miller line, that there's like, there is coercion. It's around us. If we step out of line, if I decide to wear a dress to work someday, I'll see it. I never wear a dress to work because, you know, and I never see it, but if I did, I would. But once you have that, then it seems like ideology might play a totally different role than getting me to conform. It might rather be the kind of false explanation of why I conform. Why didn't you wear a dress? Ron, I don't like to wear dresses. I like, you know, that's not the way I like to look. That's not myself. So it's a kind of, I'm wondering whether there's another role for ideology here, which is to, and you get this in Catherine McKinnon a lot. She says, you know, why did some woman who was subject to sexual violence say it was consensual? And she says, because in McKinnon, it's like, it's too embarrassing or horrifying to think that you weren't in charge. So you say, I chose this. I did this. This is my choice. I wonder whether ideology has a different role. We're responding to coercion, but but the ideology leads us to explain our behavior as not the result of coercion, but rather as the result of our choices.
Yeah, okay, so I think that so when I think of the ideology, I think of it as the tools that we have to explain our choices. I'm not interested in, you know, so if you think, okay, either you were forced or you chose it and it is your preference, that's where the ideology lives. It's in the structuring of our explanatory strategies, our scripts, our whatever. So you know, think of first comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in the baby carriage, right? For a lot of people, that's all that is, first, for some people, that's the only form of life that they see for themselves, right? They don't see other alternatives. And it's not that they're thinking, oh, I would be coerced if I did something else. They haven't got, you know, non-binary. What is that, right? Same-sex marriage, what is that, right? It's not even on the horizon of self-understanding. And so where I want to situate ideology is in the structuring of our choices, right? So that for, you know, you don't even, you know, I would guess that most of your life, it never occurred to you to wear a dress to work, right? Because that wasn't even an option for you. And so, but that is due to the kind of the cultural techne, the semiotics has limited and shaped what is imaginable or possible. And so where I want to put ideology is kind of in there, not in the explanation of why well, it's kind of part of the explanation of why I do it. So maybe I'm thinking with you, yes, part of the explanation of why I do this is ideological, because that's what shapes my self-understanding, my sense of my choice architecture, all of that kind of stuff. Is that responsive?
Yeah, that's very helpful. So on your way of thinking about it, there probably is there's no human life without ideology, since presumably any human in any society that we recognize as such will have some cultural horizon of choices available to them. So we can't by itself say that, and then we'd want to sort of be able to order those societies. There will be some that are more and less oppressive. But
Yeah.
they'll all be ideological. Even the least oppressive ones will have limits, you know, cultural limits on our horizons, presumably, about what seems like options to us.
Right, but I don't think that all limitations of options are unjust, right? So I think that there's going to be, so in principle, there could be just societies where the options that were provided to us were fine, right? They're not, so here's, I'm trying to find the place in the text where I talk about this. And I can't find it. So I offered three, anyway, I can't find it in the text. But I offered three criteria. So a cultural techne, right? You can't live as a human being without a cultural techne. I mean, you can be a proto-human being without a cultural techne, or a kind of a not socialized human being without a cultural techne. But in order for people to live a human life, there's got to be some cultural techne, right? And that shapes your cognition and your sense of possibilities and and your scripts that you use to navigate the world, because we're social beings. Okay, so sometimes those scripts distort our understanding of what's valuable. So capitalism does that. Capitalism is a reductionist monist theory of values, so that everything's value is its exchange value. And this is crap, and it distorts our understanding of women's bodies and of, you know, all these sorts of things. It can disorganize, it can organize us in unjust ways. Capitalism is another example. It organizes this in exploitive ways. And that's really bad. And it can also, there was the third one. Those are the two that I usually talk about, but I've added one recently and I can't remember it off the top of my head, but you see what I'm saying. But if you have a society that doesn't, where the cultural techne doesn't organize us in bad ways and doesn't sort of prevent us from appreciating a plurality of values, then you can be okay, right? It's not ideological. But we haven't ever seen anything like that, as far as I know.
Good. So one, I'll just say one thing that I've made use of is not just the number of like roles that are available to you, but Anthony Appiah uses this phrase in one place of tightly scripted roles. I like that idea, right? So there's an idea that some of your roles are very tightly scripted, and that seems very oppressive. And you imagine sort of literally being scripted to move your bodies in certain ways and not having choices. So
Totally.
that's like, the number of roles and the scriptedness of those roles seems relevant. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
That was a wonderful dialogue, and I would actually follow up if anyone else.
Can I just really quickly sort of share my screen of that? I found the particular page where I need to go. I'm sorry if I didn't find it before.
All right.
Okay, so can you see structural injustice occurs when the practices that create the network of positions to distribute resources unjustly? Okay, so you know, you've got money in one community and toxic waste in another, distort our understanding of what's valuable, everything is exchange value, and organize us in ways that are unjust or harmful or wrong. So those are the three that I have in mind right now, but of course I don't mean them to be, you know, the only ones.
Right. Any other questions? If not, I will jump in. Precisely on, again, in a way, kind of following up this thread, I want, in a way, to, before I get to the question, to understand a bit more the relationship between the cultural technique and social norms. Is it a sort of superordinate relationship between them? Because on one hand, I understand the cultural technique is in as a tool, as you said, as a sort of structuring.
A set of tools. It's a set of tools.
Yeah, a bit like, okay, toolbox, let's call it, like that structures our choices, but also gives us this kind of the framing effect that sort of has this psychological schema, or the way of seeing things, as you put it, filtering and shaping mechanism that kind of underlines our coordination. And then when we think about social norms, it's kind of, it feels to me that what matters is the behavior. And you could say like, okay, behavior implies that kind of psychology and all the toolbox that we have. So I want, to understand like the fine kind of the granularity between those, the technique and the norms. And then coming to the question is, when we think of disrupting or resisting, or projects of resistance and basically changing the norms or the cultural techne, who are the, as it were, the agents or the forces that will kind of create that mass, that will, create the sufficient force and mass in those shocks that will kind of move us from the stable equilibrium to moving to a different, either cultural techne or norms, and how do those pan out? Like, who is it? Is it like the oppressed group who has to put pressure on that, or it might be the advantaged group that may initiate a change?
Great. So let me, I'm going to share my screen again. And I want to admit completely that, let me get them all out.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm talking about a cultural techne or culture as a set of tools, it's a grab bag at this point. In a way, I'm sort of, cultural studies people have been working on this for generations, and I'm just sort of grabbing it as a general category of stuff. So I think of simple meanings like pink means girl and red means stop, and stop signs, for example, are part of the apparatus of the cultural techne. And so we use the meaning of red and the shape of the sign as the meanings embodied in the apparatus to get people to stop at stop signs. Pink means girl. In cultures, especially where you need to use personal pronouns that differ by gender, you need to have a way of indicating it, right? So we use that. Narrative tropes, default assumptions. These used to be called analytic truths, but since there are no analytic truths, we now call them default assumptions. That's a joke. Heuristics. Metaphor of metonymy, the pen is mightier than the sword, and these homologies, reason and passion as to man as to woman. So these are a set of tools, but they are not just beliefs. And this is something that I think David was referencing, is that they also involve a kind of responsiveness. So when you believe something, it's one thing, but you also, there's norms about how to feel and how to, and what to pay attention to and what to remember and all of that sort of stuff. And so part of what the cultural tools do is they make the things that you're supposed to remember and act on sparkle. That's how I think of it. So that those are the things that you see and you hook onto them. And then and if you've properly internalized it, then you know the right response. You have learned the right response to the sparkly thing or to the whatever. And so these are how I'm thinking about, it doesn't really separate the idea of norms yet. I think I need to, from the way in which I'm understanding the cultural techne. But what I want to be able to say is that the techne includes sort of rules for right responses, rules for right feeling and things like that. But what makes it, Charlotte Witt's work, I'm just reading her draft book on social normativity. And so maybe I'll have more answers after the fact, but I don't think it's all about preferences and preference satisfaction. But when you come to like, who does the change? I think sometimes it's a matter of accident, like the pandemic or a flood. That's going to bring about change. Sometimes it's a change in the material conditions that were unintended, like curb cuts. Curb cuts were mandated in 1990 and with the Americans with Disabilities Act. But people who, it's universal access in the sense that people carrying luggage or dragging luggage and people with strollers and whatever have greater access to public buildings, public libraries, city areas because of it. And so curb cuts were something that made a change. It's a material change. Material changes are extremely important in prompting social change. But when we're talking about social movements, I personally believe that we need not to think in terms of identity categories like women or Blacks or people of color or the disabled. We need to shift our identities for the purpose of a social movement to feminist, anti-racist, anti-ableist, and you have a movement that is maybe privileges the perspectives and the point of view and the knowledge of those who are most deeply affected. But the movement needs to be a movement of solidarity. Well, it's not just it depends what you mean by solidarity. The movement is good for all of us. And we are all committed to it to make our collective world better. And that's how I think of social movements. So anyway.
That's great, thank you. And I see, I think Francesco Guerra. Great to see you.
Hi. Good to see you. I haven't yet. There you are. Hi.
Hello, everybody. I have a question about the structural systemic I think it's the last slide that you, or the penultimate one that you showed us some minutes ago. And I guess it's a clarificatory question because I had understood initially your distinction between structure and system along the lines of a kind of type token distinction. And I couldn't quite figure out how your definition of the structural systemic oppression distinction sort of followed from the original distinction of the of structure and system. I mean, here it seems that you emphasize in the case of the system this self-reinforcing adaptive element, which I don't know. I mean, why couldn't it be a property of a structure to have these characteristics? I mean, I just asking for a clarification of how it follows.
So here we're talking about the injustice, right? So we're worried about the structure, the practices that create the positions and relations. So the edges and nodes, the edges and vertices, the nodes and relations. And so we're thinking about, and the practices are what distribute these through that set of relations. But I think that when I'm thinking about systemic injustice, I'm thinking of it being maintained in a complex system. So what's distinctive of complex systems is they're self-reinforcing and adaptive, in the sense that what I mean by adaptive here is that the system responds to perturbations in ways that incorporate them and maintain itself. So it's adaptive. It's not adaptive to human good or anything like that. It's just that it's part of the idea of a homeostasis. And and so what I'm thinking about systems is that they are these complex phenomena that do not have a central organizer, that are homeostatic, and that these practices are part of and help maintain. And in doing so, they create the subject. So I'm thinking that what's happening is that the positions are structured with power and whatever like that, but it's not until they're instantiated in the system that you really get systemic injustice. Am I missing something?
No. I think that clarifies, I think, what you have in mind. I guess I just didn't get how it followed from the initial, because I thought about this as a kind of token type, and then I couldn't find the same in the later distinction.
Yeah, so I think part of what's going on is that maybe I did talk about token type, but I think what I'm trying to get at is both are dynamic, that's for sure. But the causal interactions are happening in the system, because that's where you've got things, instantiated, and the causation happens between the things that are instantiated along these relations or in light of those relations. And when we're looking at the structure, it is in a sense an abstraction. But what I'm thinking of, it's kind of like the abstract form of the causal interactions that are actually happening in the system, and the ways in which those interactions are constrained by physical laws, but also by social norms and law and legal laws like that. So there is a type token dimension of it, but I think that there's also a difference in where the causation is actually happening, because I want the causation to be happening in the system. So maybe there's a problem if I go back to what you were pointing to. I say the practices are distributing. So I think that what I'm imagining is this network of positions and relations. That's not going to be causal. That's going to be the structure. And the practices create that structure. And that structure is going to be the roots by which resources are distributed, the roots by which, when we occupy those positions, we can see or not see certain things as valuable. And they organize us because of the network of relations that are harmful. So there are these relations between individuals that are made available by the positions and relations. So I think what is misleading here, and that you pointed to, is that the structure really is this network of positions and relations that are the channels that canalize. I mean, as when people talk about the canals and they're the, you know, when you think about a mountain that has a ski slopes on it, and you see that when you look at the mountain, even in the summer, some of the trails and the parts on it are groomed. And I'm thinking of the network of positions and relations as sort of the groomed geography, or again, going back to the maze example, the structure of the maze. And you know, some are hilly and some are not in the mountain. Some are easy, some are hard. And so that's the network. And then what happens is that we get the system when we put people in it, and they're starting to go down the hills and they run into each other, or, you know, they have them badly marked. And so they don't, you know, people have accidents that are terrible. That's the kind of picture I have in mind. Does that help?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to take up anybody's time, but, you know, yeah. I mean, can I say just one more thing? I mean, I just think that, you know, this distinction between system and structure is always a little bit problematic, which doesn't mean that it's not useful. But in the social sciences, I mean, and in social metaphysics, I mean, because, you know, that's what we're interested in the end. I mean, there's an obvious drift. Anytime you're trying to explain something, there's an obvious drift towards the abstraction, the more abstract level of explanation, right? I mean, of course, you can tell very concrete stories about what is going on in one setting. You know, like anthropologists sometimes do this. You know, economic historians do this. But then as soon as you try to sort of give some sort of general explanation of what is going on, you immediately begin to talk, you know, in abstract terms. You know, you talk about information, expectation, preferences, blah, blah, blah. And so one of the key questions.
Yeah, that's not what I talk about when I explain things. I don't talk about preferences and individual psychology, because I'm
interest, right? Okay, interests, you know, if you don't like preferences, but, you know, still
I don't talk about.
But it's still a more general term than, you know, this the very concrete, you know, sort of how things work in a particular setting. Now, the key question is, where is the causality? And obviously, as materialists, you know, we all believe that, you know, there is material causality, but then, you know, is there also some kind of social story to be told about, you know, causation at some other level?
No, I don't. I'm not in the mind. So anything that you're saying about psychology is not part of my explanatory strategy. I talk about material things rubbing up against bodies. I talk about ways in which stop signs, you know, stop us, right? I'm not that interested in the mind. I really don't care that much about the mind, and this is partly why, is that people behave the same way, even though they have very different ideas and attitudes and whatever, because of the structure of their social context, right? And the structure is going to be the material structure of the social context, whether childcare is available, right? Most women, regardless of whether they believe that mothers ought to stay home or not, you know, they may value that, they may believe it, they may care about it. but, or whether they believe that women ought to work in the home. The economy is going to be, and the availability of childcare is going to be the main explanatory factors of that woman's conditions, of that woman's behavior. And I'm not that interested that you can have any number of different beliefs and still put your child in K care or quit your job and go home. I'm not interested in that. Yeah, they play some small role, but it's not for me the site of explanation. And I don't think you have to go abstract to say that structures have causal import. And if you look at my paper on what is a social structural explanation, I go into this in great detail. And I think that I could talk forever about causation, but I really think that structures have causal power. And you can see on the roof, right? The relation of load bearing has causal import, and so does many other of the structural conditions that we stand in. Also, it depends. So I don't believe that it's all about events. I believe counterfactual theory of causation. So as long as you have counterfactual dependencies between laws and such like that, and I don't think you have to go that abstract. Also, more general explanations are more robust. This is something that is spoken at length in the Garfinkel book, Forms of Explanation. I highly recommend that book because depending on, even on specific questions that you're asking an explanation for, if you go to type, you're going to have a much more robust explanation and stable explanation. So yeah, I could talk forever. I think we just really disagree about the nature of explanation and causation.
That's wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm afraid we are ready for the next talk. So let's thank once again Sally for a
thank you all
talk and
I really appreciate it. I'll upload my paper on explanation if you're interested, not assuming you will be, but
great.
And I strongly recommend the Garfinkel book, Forms of Explanation.
Super. So now